Okay, so part one talked about different kinds of science, discovery science and the scientific method, and then some ways that we create the experiments. So science is based on data, right? So it's you if the data changes because the climate's changing or we have new instruments, new technology that can detect different things and that's changing how we perceive and changing the data, then if it's true science, then you need to be willing to change your stance or change different ideas about things based on that new evidence. Science is peer reviewed. So when you have an experiment, so if you were a scientist, you would do your experiment and then you would publish your paper, right? So you write up a little paper about it, you have all your data in there, you come to your conclusions, and then you give it to other people in your field to read. And that's called peer review. And other people in your field are competitive. So they're competing with you, right? So they're going to tear you apart. They're going to look at your paper and they're going to go, well, why didn't you do this? Or this data doesn't look right, or you should have done this again, or different things like that. So it goes through peer review. So before you're actually published in like a journal article or before what your experiment goes out to the world, it's peer reviewed, which is good because it's a balance, right? You might think you did the best job in the world and other people will poke holes in your science experiment and you might realize, oh, okay, I need to do this, that, and the other thing before it actually, um, I need to prove my case even more with more data. Um, Science will take account of all new discoveries. It invites criticism. Um, that's basically how things work, right? If everybody just took things at face value, just believed everything, then we would be in a lot of trouble. We wouldn't advance in the world of learning, right? We wouldn't be learning new things. We need to criticize and question everything around us. You need to have verifiable results. So the results in science need to be replicated and verified. So if I do an experiment and I get a certain set of data, and then you do the experiment and you get completely different data, then we need to do this experiment again, or because we need to verify, we need to look at the data and we need to figure out like what went wrong, right? So every time you do the experiment, you should get the same data. So they need to be verifiable results. Um, Real science is going to limit the claims of its usefulness. So if you do an experiment on one particular molecule on sleep, you're not going to say it's also good for relaxation and anti-anxiety and anti-inflammatory. You're not going to do that. You're just, because your experiment only looked at sleep and it only looked at this one drug. So you're going to be very careful and limit your claims. You can't say, oh, this is great for everything. You're going to say, no, no, no. My experiment was just looking at maybe even falling asleep or just looking at staying asleep once you're asleep, right? So there are very, very specific things that you're studying in science. So you don't want to just claim it's good for anything. And then you also have to have accurate measurements, right? So let's turn our attention to pseudoscience. So pseudoscience out there is actually it's pervasive in the world. There's a lot of pseudoscience out there. In the notes, I have pseudoscience is a field of study that's falsely presented as having a scientific basis. Being able to spot pseudoscience is key in critical thinking skills. So it's actually pretty hard because a lot of pseudoscience will present itself as science and they'll use scientific words, they might have some data, but it's very holy and it's not actual science. So pseudoscience usually has fixed ideas. So if you have, one of my pseudoscience examples is astrological signs. So, I'm a Pisces and I guess I'm not supposed to get along with Aries. I have no idea. I just heard this a very long time ago, but that's a fixed idea, right? So the fact that there are millions and millions of Pisces out there and millions of Aries out there, I'm sure there's lots of friends who are Pisces and Aries. But the idea never changes. Like, oh no, you're supposed to get along with these astrological signs. You don't get along with these astrological signs. There's no peer review in pseudoscience. No one's going to criticize your pseudoscience beliefs. Pseudoscience might cherry pick what kind of science out there supports it. So, for example, I also have power of crystals, or we can stick with the astrological signs, right? So there might be, and actually astrological signs would be like using anecdotal evidence. Anyways, so if you only select favorable discoveries, so there might be some science out there. Let's talk about like some herbal supplements that are not, wholly vetted. There might be a few papers out there on some favorable discoveries about CBD oil. Let's just use CBD because CBD oil is everywhere right now, right? So there are lots of papers on CBD oil, but not on everything. So CBD oil it's been touted to be like anti-inflammatory. It's been touted to be, use it to calm down, use it for muscle aches, use it for menstrual cramps, use it for sleeping, use it for depression. So there's all these different kinds of uses, right? So this is where CBD oil comes in, claims of widespread usefulness. But they can cherry pick. So if you see an article on CBD oil, they're going to pick only the papers, the real science research papers out there that support their stance and ignore all the other ones, right? So that's not science, because science, you have to take into account all the new discoveries, whether it's good for you or bad for you, right? So if you have a certain belief and you want to believe that CBD oil is really, really good for depression, there's not a lot of papers out there on that. And so any criticism to your pseudoscience might be seen as conspiracy, or you're just not going to like it very much. You're not going to have repeatable results with pseudoscience. And sometimes they just use ballpark measurements for pseudoscience. So you want to be really careful. Pseudoscience, again, there's a lot of pseudoscience out there. So these are some examples of pseudoscience: ancient astronauts in crop circles, that aliens have visited Earth. Well, right off the bat, we can't prove this, right? This is outside of the realm of science, because science, you have to have a hypothesis that's observable and provable and verifiable. And we can't verify that there, long time ago, that there's aliens that came to the Earth. No one saw. So anything to do with, the mystical world, or aliens, or things like that, like extraterrestrial life, that at the moment is in pseudoscience, because we cannot prove the existence. The moon landing conspiracy or flat earthers are just there's nothing to prove that this is a belief system. Astrology, as I mentioned, ESP, extrasensory perception. They actually did a whole lot of testing on this, and they just never got reliable, repeatable results for ESP. There's also kind of interesting work on like plants. If plants can, if you play different music for plants, the plants will respond in different ways. That's been debunked. Conversion therapy, right? You can change the person's sexual preference from homosexual to heterosexual based on this therapy. That's pseudoscience. Vaccinations cause autism, flu shots give you the flu, et cetera, et cetera. So there's lots of these things out there. So as a beginning biology student, and as someone who is going to be around on the earth for a very long time, my advice is just to always take something that someone says to you with a grain of salt, because unless it's in a scientific journal, it's been, sort of vetted in the way that science has to be vetted, you want to take that news with a grain of salt. So how to make a scientist's head explode: anecdotal evidence isn't valid. This is the scientist. Yes, it is. I once used an anecdote as evidence, and later I turned out to be right. So what is anecdotal evidence? Anecdotal evidence, in your outline, I actually have the sort of more succinct description. So anecdotal evidence is, so a lot of pseudoscience depends on this kind of evidence. This is the assertion that based on like a single or very few examples that don't support a general conclusion. So this is that kind of thing where you're just like, oh, my friend took CBD oil and she was totally chilled out. She was calm, she had no more anxiety. That's your one friend. And remember, there's a placebo effect, which is very real. So if you go around and say, well, CBD oil is good for anxiety because my one friend took it and she found it helped, that's not grounds for making that big claim, right? That's one example. That's anecdotal evidence. So you want to be careful with anecdotal evidence. In real science, you know, for a vaccine, for example, this coronavirus vaccine, in order for a vaccine to be proven safe and effective, they have to treat hundreds of thousands of people. They're not just treating 10 people. And then if the 10 people that they treat respond favorably to the vaccine, are they going to make the vaccine for millions or billions of people? No, because that would be irresponsible, right? That's not a large pool of data. That would be anecdotal evidence. So you have to have a large, vast pool of data to draw your inferences from or your inductive reasoning from, right? So just be aware of anecdotal evidence. Sometimes people who do not like the concept of global warming, they'll say like, oh my God, we're having such a mild summer. You know, global warming isn't real. But that's one summer out of like, you know, thousands of years on record. And it might be only one area of the world. It doesn't speak for the entire planet. It speaks for, you know, Los Angeles. So you have to be really careful with anecdotal evidence. Anyways, I hope you understand what that means. And I think we're going to move on now. So this is just a story on anecdotal evidence on wheatgrass. So the wheatgrass claims is just everywhere. If you read this through, diabetes, bacterial infections, bronchitis, colds, fevers, inflammation, blah, 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 skin problems, it's good for everything. Well, what made wheatgrass juice such a huge, you know, alternative health elixir? And the origin of it was this person in the 1940s who noticed that dogs and cats will eat grass when they aren't feeling good. And they just basically said, well, humans should probably eat some grass too when they're feeling sick. So because we don't have all the stomachs to digest the grass that cows do, she decided to blend it up so that you are partially digesting the wheatgrass, and then we can just take the juice. And so that way we don't have to digest the fiber, that we can just get the juice of wheatgrass, and it's going to be curative for us, right? Well, that's the origin of wheatgrass. So it's pretty much anecdotal evidence. This falls into the pseudoscience category. I'm sure there is a lot of research on wheatgrass. I haven't actually looked into it, but you have to look at those research projects and you have to look at their conclusions, and each project is going to be based on one very, very small effect. Anyhow, just thought I'd put that out there. So if you are a believer in wheatgrass juice and you like the taste of it and you think it makes you feel better, I guess there's no harm in that. But if you are doing it because you feel like it's going to make you a lot healthier, you can probably save your money, right? And just eat some vegetables. All right, let's talk about hypothesis versus theory. So letter D, the scientific theory. So we talked about a hypothesis, right? Hypothesis is an educated guess that you are trying to answer a very specific question. You're trying to answer why that one flashlight's not working. You're trying to answer why pie crusts are flaky. You have to be able to test it, right? And a hypothesis is not tested much. So this is like a one single, very small experiment that your hypothesis is good for. A theory is very different. A theory in science is a well-accepted answer. It's well-tested, supported by many, many experiments. Many here is, you know, hundreds or thousands of experiments. And so theories are basically truth. And in your lab exercises, you have a video on what a hypothesis versus theory versus law versus something else I can't remember, but you're going to watch that video. So it's much broader than a hypothesis. So let's look at some examples. Some examples of a theory in your outline. So the theory of gravitation, the theory of evolution, the theory of global warming. So let's just take global warming, for example, right? So what out there supports the theory of global warming? There are so many experiments done, hypotheses tested, and supported by data that all support this idea of global warming. So there's oceanographers taking ocean temperatures, there's atmosphere, people looking at the different gas concentrations in the air, there's the temperature, there's waterfall changes, there's those storms, megastorms, the changes in hurricane frequency. So there's all these different aspects of weather patterns, moisture patterns, ice melting that all support this idea of global warming. They can track it with the Industrial Revolution, the input of CO2 into the atmosphere, the greenhouse gas into the atmosphere. So there's thousands and thousands and thousands of experiments done over years that support the theory of global climate change. So that's the same as evolution. That's the same for gravitation. So maybe one of those experiments in global warming, maybe one of those experiments is refuted with new data. Maybe there's a new device, it changed the data. But that's only one of thousands, right? So you can tweak maybe one or two experiments and change the sort of the conclusion of one or two experiments, but it doesn't change the overall view that the climate is changing. It's due to human activity. So I hope that makes sense to you. So a hypothesis is very small. You have to test it. It's just for one experiment. A theory is really broad, and it's basically truth in terms of scientists. So when you say theory in general, like if you're out in the world and you're like, oh, my theory on why Netflix is putting out such crappy videos now, right? That word theory is, you're kind of using it like a hypothesis. So even though we say the word theory a lot in normal language, it's not the same way that scientists use the word theory. Theory is very heavy and profound, and almost fact in the science world. Okay, let's move on to our last couple of topics here. So there's a property of living things. So we are going to be looking at life and what does life have in common, right? So if you're looking at the PowerPoint slide, I have a bunch of different forms of life on here. There is a fish, deep water fish. This is a sponge. Here's a bunch of people. This is an amoeba. This is bacteria. This is, of course, a spider and a worm. A tree. This looks like throw up, but it's called a slime mold. It's a living thing. And of course, our bioluminescent jellyfish. So all of these things have 7, and actually I should change that because your book added an 8th that we should be adding to your notes. So number 1 is order. Order means that everything that's alive, even one cell here, has a specific order to it. So there are organelles in one area, there's a membrane in the other area, there's chemical reactions that happen here and not there. So everything is very, very ordered from the cell, inside the organelles of the cell, up to the organism. So very, very ordered. Number 2, regulation. Everything you see here can regulate what's happening inside of its body. Even the cell here, the amoeba, inside the amoeba, what the chemicals it has, the pH it has, is different than the water surrounding it, right? So how can it control what is inside versus outside? That is regulation or homeostasis. So homeostasis is maintaining a constant internal environment that's different than the external environment. You can find the definition of homeostasis in your textbook, and you can write it down here. But that's just the gist of it. It's a way of having a constant internal environment that's different than the outside, external environment. Growth and development. So everything can grow and develop. Number 4, energy processing. Everything alive uses some kind of energy. So we'll talk about energy in chapter 5. We use the energy that's in food to drive the chemical reactions that we need to do in our bodies and also to move around in the world. So other organisms use energy, the sun, right? Plants can do that. So lots of different energy processing. Number 5, everything can respond to the environment. Even this guy that looks like a pile of throw up is able to respond to the environment. Now, responding doesn't mean moving, right? So plants don't move. Well, some plants can actually move, like close up flowers, and they can change the position of their leaves. But some things can't move, but they can still respond by making different chemical reactions happen. So if it starts to dry up, for example, some bacteria can go dormant. So they may not be able to move, but they can sense the environment is changing, and so they can respond to that change by altering the chemical reactions that's happening inside, right? So they always respond to the environment. Number 6, reproduction. Everything alive can reproduce. That's how life comes to be, right? If nothing could reproduce, everything would die, and there we go, we don't have life. Number 7, everything can evolve. So every living thing, bacteria, amoeba, trees, they evolve. When we get to evolution, organisms that you see here on this page are done evolving. So a particular organism does not evolve. You do not evolve in your lifetime, but a population evolves. So the population of people can change over a long time. A population of amoeba or a population of bacteria can change over a long time. So one individual doesn't evolve, but the population does, okay? So if that's confusing right now, don't worry, we'll talk about it later. But everything does change over time, right? So evolution is change over time. All living things are capable of doing that. And number 8, which is missing, is all living things are made of cells, just like Schleiden and Schwann had told us many, many years ago. Okay, let's move on to the next topic. Oh, which of the following is not a characteristic of all living things? So go ahead and pause to think about it. Okay, if you're back, the answer is, what did you think? C, not a characteristic of living things. So composed of multiple cells. Let's go back to this picture. This amoeba is only one cell. It's a living thing, but it's only made of one cell. These bacteria, this is one bacteria attached to another bacteria. So this is kind of confusing because we have each little oval here is a bacterial cell itself, but we kind of have a couple of ovals attached to each other. But each one of these is one bacterium. So living things don't have to be big. They don't have to be multicellular. They can be unicellular, which means only one cell big. All right, let's look at our last couple topics here, hierarchy of organization. You should write down the definitions or descriptions from the book if you're not sure what these are. So let's start with a very, very basic level. So these are all building blocks of life, right? So the smallest, most elemental building blocks in atom. Atoms are called elements on the periodic table. So if you guys can think of, like, what's an atom you can think of? A lot of people say oxygen, which is true. Oxygen is an atom. Carbon, hydrogen, sodium. Those are all atoms. And so we build up from an atom, right? So if you put atoms together, you make a molecule. And the atoms are put together with bonds, chemical bonds. That's chapter 2. So atoms are put together with chemical bonds. They make molecules. Molecules, what's an example of a molecule you can think of? Let's go with water, right? Water, H2O. Most people have heard of water. H2O, so 2 hydrogens and 1 oxygen put together in a very specific way make water, okay? So the way that they're put together matters. So molecules, let's think of some other molecules. How about sucrose, the table sugar we looked at, right? That's a molecule. We can also think of amino acid, which is a protein, right? So, or the building blocks of proteins, those are molecules. So molecules are everywhere. A molecule of oxygen that you breathe, a molecule of CO2 that you breathe out, carbon dioxide. Now, the next level up, when you have these very small molecules and put them together in very specific ways, you can create macromolecules. A macromolecule, macro means big. In biology, there are 4 different classes of macromolecules, and we'll learn this. This is chapter 3. I'll give you a quick preview. The macromolecules are proteins. Proteins are very big molecules. I mentioned that amino acids build proteins. Amino acid is a molecule. When you put amino acids together in a very special way, it makes a protein, right? You go up to a bigger molecule. Proteins are like thousands of amino acids put together. All right, so proteins is one, carbohydrates is another, lipids is another, and nucleic acids like DNA and RNA. That's the fourth one. So those are our macromolecules. When macromolecules are put together again, right, you're building another level, right? So we have our atoms make molecules. Molecules make macromolecules. Macromolecules make organelles. So when you have an organelle, so a lot of these, if this is the first time you're taking biology, organelles are small structures inside of a cell that have jobs. They have functions. You can think of it, a cell, as like a small company or a factory, and the organelles are like nano factories, like little workstations within the factory. So they do things. I ask the class sometimes to name an organelle, and nucleus is named a lot. So if you guys heard of the word nucleus, nucleus is an organelle. It's something inside of a cell that houses the DNA. So the nucleus is made of a combination of nucleic acids, lipids, proteins. So there's a lot of macromolecules that go into creating that nucleus, the organelle. So organelles, we'll learn organelles, that's chapter 4. Organelles will come together, right? Different organelles will arrange themselves in a very specific way to make the next level, which is a cell. So there are cells, and this is also in chapter 4. We'll talk about 2 different kinds of cells in the world, prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells. Don't worry about knowing them now, but chapters 1 through 4 on the first test. So the cells, you'll get to know those in a second. Now, what do cells make? So if you put different kinds of cells together, you make a tissue. So tissues are there's 4 different tissue types in humans or in mammals. So if you take anatomy later on, you are going to spend 2 weeks on tissues, but I'll give you the quick, and then we're going to talk about tissues very quickly in this class. But the tissues are muscle tissue is one kind of tissue, nervous tissue is another kind of tissue, connective tissue, and then something called epithelial tissue. Epithelial tissue is the lining of your body, like your skin is made of epithelial tissue. So tissues are have a function, right, that's different than the cells. So if you look at your heart, which is a muscle, the muscle is also combining with connective tissue to make that, I'm sorry, muscle, I wanted to say organ, heart's an organ. Tissues, like muscle tissue, is actually made of muscle cells, yes, but also it's going to have blood cells, neurons that come help the muscle contract. So tissues are made of different kinds of cells. Then tissues will create organs. So now let's look at the heart, right? The heart is mainly muscle tissue, but it also has connective tissue. It also has nervous tissue. It also has epithelial tissue. So it has all 4 tissue types making that organ, the heart. What's the heart part of, right? So the heart has a job itself, but it works with a whole system. So organs come together to form an organ system. So if we think about the heart, what organ system does the heart belong to? So you might think cardiovascular system, right? The cardiovascular system is not just the heart. It's the heart, and it's also the blood vessels that take the blood and go all around the body. So it's the blood and the blood vessels. So that's the cardiovascular system. Now, we have a lot of systems, right? We have our reproductive system, we have a cardiovascular system, we have muscle system, skeletal system, lots of systems. What do those build, right? What do organ systems build? They build an organism. So one organism, let's take a human because we are very familiar with humans. Okay, so an organism is a human. It could also be a tree. So if you look at trees, also have different systems. They do have a vascular system. They have a system of tubes that can bring water and sap up and down. There's different tissues in trees and plants. But since we're more familiar with people, I think we'll stick with people. So organism is a human. Now, what do humans do? When you get a bunch of humans together, that's a population. A population is a group of the same species which inhabit the same geographical area. So this is kind of loose. The definition of population is kind of loose. You can create any population you want. So you can say, I want to look at the population of students at LAVC. You can say, I want to look at the population in Los Angeles, of the human population in Los Angeles. You can say, I want to look at the population of western blue jays in the Los Padres mountain chain, right? So you can choose what geographical area you're looking at, but the population is always the same species. Now, what's after that? A community. So a community is every living thing, all the organisms that inhabit a particular area. So let's think about Los Angeles, right? What's the community of Los Angeles? So everything that's alive, right? Of course, there's the people of Los Angeles. There's the plants. There's going to be the animals. There's going to be the bacteria, the fungi, the mold spores, right? So every single living thing that's in Los Angeles will be part of that community. Los Angeles is a big thing to think about. You can also just think about the community in like Griffith Park, right? If you go to Griffith Park, what's the community just in Griffith Park? Everything that's alive there. And how does that community different? How is that different than the community of Venice Beach? Or how is it different than the community of Joshua Tree, like a desert, okay? So there are scientists that study communities. There are scientists that if you add up communities, it creates an ecosystem. You're adding abiotic factors to ecosystems. So ecosystems are living things, but also non-living factors. So what is a non-living factor that's present, let's say in Griffith Park? So it might be the hills, it might be the waterfall, right? It might be the weather, it might be the wind, it might be the soil, the nutrients in the soil. So those are all examples of abiotic factors. And then all the ecosystems together on the planet create the biosphere. The biosphere is the global ecosystem, the sum of the planet's ecosystems, okay? So hopefully this makes sense to you, be able to identify or define these statements or these terms in the first test. And this is a quiz, right? Which term below is the smallest unit of organization? So pause it to read them. The answer is, it really sticks out, right? It's the atom, because the atom is the smallest thing ever. But let's go ahead and put these in order. Let's go smallest to largest. So we have atom first. Then I'll give you a minute to write them down, and then I'll do the answer. So pause it. All right, so we have atom, right? What'd you have next? You should have had molecule next. Atom, molecule. Excuse me. What's after that? You should have cell, okay? Then tissue, then organ, then organism, then population, then ecosystem, then biosphere. All right, hopefully you got that correct. What is the smallest level capable of demonstrating all the characteristics of life? This is a good question. I didn't talk about this yet. So let's go back to our picture here. Which level, right? Which level of organization can do all of the things here? Like in this picture, right? Going back, what can evolve? What can, looking at this, like what can evolve? What can use energy? What can reproduce? What can have an organization? What can, all those things that we talked about. At what level? What's the smallest level that has all the properties of life? And that is the cell, okay? Cells are alive. Anything smaller than the cell, organelles, macromolecules, those are not considered alive or living because they don't check off all the boxes on those characteristics of living things, okay? So they're the cell up. Okay. So last topic here, evolution. Just really quick, we have chapters 13 and 14 are about evolution, so we're just going to do a quick overview. There's a man, his statue is here, Charles Darwin, that published a very profound book at the time called On the Origin of Species by Natural Selection, or by means of natural selection. He posed the new idea that there was descent with modification. So when organisms have a baby, that baby or offspring is different or modified from the parents. And over time, nature selects which of the offspring that all of these parents had are fit for the environment. It's very cruel because the offspring that are not fit die, right? And only the offspring that have the traits that are able for them to survive in that environment will go on and also produce offspring that are similar to them. So anyhow, this descent with modification by means of natural selection was very profound at the time because everybody sort of believed other ideas, such as that all the organisms on the planet were put there as is, that there hasn't ever been any change of the human body or anything like that. So yeah, anyways, it was very a new idea at the time. But he is basically, and we know now that that is what happens. That's a fact, that evolution occurs through natural selection. But he was the first person to come up with the idea. Okay, so Charles Darwin. And this is my last example of evolution happening today. So bacteria in this example are used because bacteria have a lifespan, very fast turnover. You can have E. coli, for example, can reproduce every 20 minutes. So in a day, in 24 hours, how many generations of bacteria can you have? You have many, many generations, right? So you can look at the evolution. You can look at every time they have offspring, how that change, how the offspring change. You can look at the evolution of a population of bacteria. So what we're looking at here is a population of bacteria in a cow. And we are seeing that most of the bacteria in this cow are yellow. They are normal bacteria. We have a red bacteria here. This, by a freak accident, okay, this bacteria has antibiotic resistance. So we will get into this when we look at genetics, but bacteria do not choose how they mutate. Mutations occur very randomly, and they don't, they're not, a bacteria just can't go, oh, I want to mutate so I can survive antibiotics. That bacteria has no idea what's in the environment. It's just by accident. There's a little change in the DNA of this bacteria, and it made it more able to survive this antibiotic. So you give this cow some antibiotics, and it kills all sort of the normal bacteria, or most of the normal bacteria, except this red guy doesn't get hurt by the antibiotic because it, again, freakishly, by accident, had a mutation that allowed it to survive this drug. If you give the cows the drug over and over and over again, right, what you're going to do is you're going to kill off all of the yellow bacteria, and then the few red bacteria that survive will reproduce, and they reproduce offspring with that same mutation. If you keep killing off the yellow bacteria and the red bacteria are not harmed, you're going to get a population of red bacteria. What did we just do here? We created a population of antibiotic-resistant bacteria. This population is different than the original population, right? It evolved. Why did it evolve? Why did it change from the genetics of the yellow to the genetics of the red? Because its environment changed. The environment went from no antibiotics to antibiotics. The environment now favors those red bacteria, okay? And so the whole population changed. We can see that evolution occurred in this population. So again, one bacteria doesn't evolve, but the population evolves, right? The population changed over time. So this is actually a very true and real and worrisome example of how we use antibiotics in food. Cows are indeed given antibiotics every day that they are being fed food, because the cows, when they're grown or raised, when they're raised in a conventional large corporate farm way, there are thousands and thousands of cows. They are very, very close together. And when they're close together, and they're also fed corn, which is a food that they're not evolved to eat. They evolved to eat grass. but corn makes them grow fatter and bigger and faster so that the farm can have more meat off of the cows. Makes sense. If you were a cow farmer, you would want to sell off as many cows as possible and get them as big as possible in the shortest amount of time possible, which is what corn does. So a corn diet makes very big, fast-growing cows, but a corn diet makes them get sick easy. So in order for them not to get sick, the farmers will give them antibiotics in their food. And this is what happens. So the antibiotic-resistant bacteria in a cow this is a problem because these antibiotics are also given to humans. So if a human got sick with the red bacteria here, would this antibiotic be able to cure that human? No, right? Because it doesn't do anything to the red bacteria. So the more antibiotics are being used in the world, the more chances of antibiotic-resistant strains of bacteria being produced and existing in the world. So, not to be a Debbie Downer or like a downer about factory-raised cows or these corporate large industrial farms, but they are not good for the environment and they're not good for you. One thing that you can do to mitigate or to stop kind of this process is to try to buy less beef and to try and buy grass-fed beef. And I know that those two options, well, buying less, that's just you. If you can try to eat less beef, that'd be great. I'm not saying become a vegan. I'm not saying don't give it up altogether, just less. It's better for the environment. It's better for public health. It is more expensive to buy grass-fed beef, and I understand that we can't all do that. But maybe sometime in your life, you might have some money and you might have the option, and now you know which is the better option. So I'm not trying to tell you to do one thing or the other, but now that you're educated, you know why grass-fed beef is better for the environment and better for the health of everybody. Okay, that is it. So that's chapter 1.